What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you part 2 of my September 2018 meta analysis. Yesterday we discussed kind of all the meta contenders that we expected to do very well this past weekend at YCS 200, but today I wanted to dedicate an entire video solely to all of the underdog decks, the rogue decks that just completely came out of nowhere and managed to take up a good part of top cut representation. So we're gonna get right into it, but before we do, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you guys don't miss a single upload. And if you really love my meta analysis or any of the rest of the content that I produce, consider becoming a YouTube channel member to get your Cimo badge next to your name down in the comments, or consider supporting me on Patreon for even greater rewards. It's people like Levi that really help support the channel and make this all possible. So if you're interested, hit the join button down below or check out the links in the description. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So we're gonna go ahead and take a look at this pie chart right here. Now, this isn't a pie chart of a specific top 64 cut representation. What this is all of the rogue decks, pretty much all the decks that took up maybe one or even two of the top cut slots that really didn't have a huge representation, but across all three tournaments, YCS Columbus, YCS Mexico City, and YCS Utrecht, and kind of just all compounded into one single pie chart to kind of see which of these rogue decks managed to have the highest representation across all three tournaments. Because when you look at it this way, it kind of helps us deduce to see which of these strategies were proving the most successful across the board, rather than just some random one-off. So when you look at it this way, the deck that actually had the highest representation here was Mech Knight Invoked. Now, Mech Knight Invoked isn't really a new strategy. This is a deck that saw a lot of success in the previous format as well. I would say maybe even the format before that more so. The thing about Mech Knight Invoked, though, is I wouldn't consider it necessarily a tier 2 deck. It wasn't like True Draco last format where it was always getting several top cut slots. It was kind of a deck that, you know, managed to sneak its way in there every once in a while, but wasn't really consistent enough to hold its own. But what we see here, Mech Knight Invoked actually had some pretty good representation. I think it had like 4 top cut slots, I believe at YCS Mexico City, and I think it had 2 at YCS Utrecht. So, I mean, it was, you know, it was there, and that's something you definitely have to keep in mind. Now, one of the big contributing factors here is the release of Alistair the Invoker of Madness. Remember, Alistair the Invoker of Madness came out in Shadows in Valhalla, which came out over the summer, and this is pretty much when the last competitive season had come to a close. So really up to this point, Mech Knight Invoked had really been able to only show its power at regionals and at the UDS in Kansas City. So this is kind of its first big stage appearance. I would also consider the UDS a pretty good stage as well, but Mech Knight Invoked made a fairly decent showing for what it is. Now, I definitely think Goki getting its power curb helped this out because yes, it's a deck designed to go second, but Goki was able to just plow through so many different hand traps that when you're playing a deck like Mech Knight Invoked, you're opting to blind to go second, and in a format that's basically where you're just getting extra linked, that's not exactly an ideal situation. So even if you're playing, you know, 10, 11, 12 hand traps, sometimes it wasn't enough, and Goki would still extra link you anyway, so it didn't matter, and then you weren't even able to assemble a board, and you kind of lost that game anyway. So going second strategies kind of had it rough, but now that Goki's kind of on the decline, and we've seen the Ryzen's Pure Sky Striker, I think this gave Mech Knight Invoked a little bit more of an opportunity to shine, and obviously it showed. Now, what does this say going forward? Well, I don't necessarily know, because I feel like we're going to have to see some more time to go on, maybe another event. I know YCS Niagara takes place in a couple of weeks, so we're going to have to see how Mech Knight Invoked does as the format progresses. We also have Soul Fusion coming out with the Thunder Dragons being released, and I know there's some variants of like Invoke that play the Thunder Dragons as well. I don't know if any of those variants will do well, but it's something to keep an eye on. And basically, if you're looking at your top 5 decks, and if there's like one other deck you want to make sure you have on your radar, I would say Mech Knight Invoked, based on these numbers, is the deck you're going to want to think about. Moving on, though, to the deck that I am the most excited to talk about, Burning Abyss. Man, this deck will not die. Now, for those of you guys who did not know, Burning Abyss actually won YCS Mexico City and was in second place at YCS Utrecht. So that is just insane that Burning Abyss almost took 2 of the 3 YCSs this past weekend in a format just utterly dominated by Sky Strikers. So how is that? Well, again, I think Goki getting hit definitely contributed to that, because notice how Burning Abyss did better in the regions where Summon Sorcerers wasn't legal and Goki was still at a higher power level. I think that's rather interesting. I mean, it didn't really have a big showing in the US, but it definitely still was in attendance, that's for sure. But the thing that's interesting about Burning Abyss is it's just so consistent. There's so many good aspects to Burning Abyss. I mean, it's able to kind of go toe-to-toe with a deck like Sky Striker because they're both decks that can really grind it out and really just wither their opponent away when it comes to their resources. Now, honestly, I think Sky Striker does it a little bit better. And Sky Striker has tools that are specifically good against Burning Abyss. I mean, you've got cards like Widow Anchor for the Beatrice, which is an amazing counter to that card. And with most of the players opting to play Shark Cannon, that can disrupt stuff like the Dante Seer Loop. So there's a lot of different tools Sky Striker has at its disposal, but Burning Abyss, for what it has just managed to show that it is still resilient even to this day. And how is this going to look going forward? Well, what's amazing about Burning Abyss is its adaptability. I mean, we've seen Burning Abyss play Floodgates in the past. We've seen it play, a ton of aggressive tools like Blackluster Soldier, Orbital Hydrolander. In this variant, we've seen Kaijus to basically tribute over one of the opposing Sky Striker players' Link monsters, shuts down all of their back row, and then Burning Abyss just OTKs them. And you've got Sekka's Light now, which is basically like 3 copies of Pot of Greed in the deck. There are so many ways you can take Burning Abyss, and honestly, now that the format's starting to become more and more defined, and we see Sky Strikers are pretty much overwhelmingly the dominating deck of the format, the Burning Abyss players might start to show up and, tune their decks to basically opt for that Sky Striker matchup, and if they can find the secret formula, Burning Abyss could be a very solid rogue contender moving into this format. The fact that it was able to win YCS Mexico City and take second place at Utrecht, the crazy thing is, it's not like it had high representation in the top cut. That was like the only one, or maybe there might have been one other Burning Abyss in top cut, and it managed to make it all the way through. So we saw this happen at the national season last year. Burning Abyss was kind of this deck that just came out of nowhere and took the format by storm. Doesn't mean that the deck, is a resounding, just amazing answer to the format, but it just goes to show that a deck like this is still able to compete even in this crazy new format that we now find ourselves in. Moving on though, I do want to talk about another deck, and that is Paleozoic. Now, this is kind of like a lesser version of Altergeist. Altergeist players and Paleozoic players might fight over that, but comparatively to what results we've seen before, this is kind of just a different take on a trap-based deck like Altergeist. It has its own advantages and disadvantages by comparison, but I think Altergeist is definitely the stronger deck, especially when you're looking at it in a Sky Striker-based meta. Altergeist fares fairly well against Sky Striker as a whole. Paleozoic, though, it's got a lot of good things going for it. I mean, Swap Fog's still at 3, you've got Totally Awesome still at 3. The way that the deck just generates advantage is really good, and even if the deck is forced to go second, setting a whole hand of traps that are Paleos, it's not that bad. The deck can actually play fairly well going second. My biggest fear is, with a Sky Striker meta, a lot of people are going to be mating stuff like Twin Twister, Heavy Storm Duster, a lot of really just strong, aggressive back row removal. So I don't know if these decks are going to be able to flourish in a meta like this, because those cards are just excellent in the mirror match. We'll just have to see. I think Altergeist is a little bit more resilient in that fact because it has a stronger base of monsters. But again, it's a pretty solid deck. It took like 3 slots out of, the entire just YCS 200 breakdown, and it made it pretty far. I think one of them made like either top 32 or top 16, which is pretty commendable. So just something else to keep in mind there. Another deck that actually did fairly well was Pendulum Magician. Now, although Heavy Metalfoes Electromite did go to 1, it's still a pretty decent deck for what it is. It's able to assemble boards of multiple negations, so that's something you definitely have to be wary of. It's a bit more of a glass cannon, but even with that in mind, it was still able to take top cuts at these events. And honestly, it's a pretty cheap deck too, so if you're looking for something really cheap to pick up, I mean, Burning Abyss kind of falls into the same category here. It's a very powerful deck for what you're paying for. having only one Electromite now, and especially because it got reprinted, is just makes the deck even more affordable. Isn't really too much to go with it, and you have the fact you can abuse the Pendulum summoning mechanic even more than ever. Not to mention, the deck is all spellcasters, so you could kind of run some tech like Secret Village. I don't know if they're going to go that route, but we'll just have to wait and see. Couple of other decks though, we had Cyber Dragons. Now a lot of people had high hopes for Cyber Dragons. I know some good players like Blair Hunter and Team Samurai X1 were also piloting them at the YCS 200, and a couple of them managed to squeeze into the top cut. And Cyber Dragon, you know, I just said earlier that going second, especially in that Goki dominated format, might not have been the most ideal choice, but a deck like Cyber Dragon is able to do it. And the reason I say that is because you have a card like Chimera Tech Mega Fleet Dragon that can remove those monsters from the extra monster zone rather easily and consistently, and Cyber Dragon has a lot of power behind it. If you go first, you can set up a board of like Cyber Dragon Seeger plus, you know, Griffin and Infinity, or just some of these other crazy negation boards. And even if you go second, that's kind of where its ideal situation is, because there's so many ways for a deck like that to OTK, especially with your 6th card on the draw, that it's a really solid option. It didn't do as well, I think, as a lot of people had hoped, but it's definitely on the map. And if you're going to any event, especially a YCS or hell, even a regional, you can bet money that there's going to be Cyber Dragon players in attendance. One other deck that was really under the radar was the Dark Warrior deck that was being piloted by several of the top players. I believe Aaron Furman was playing it, I believe Jesse Cotton, and I think Isala, just some really renowned players that were piloting this deck. And basically, if you don't know what this is, it's kind of just like good warrior monsters deck, and basically it's kind of like Goki, where it can just extra link and make Gumblar, but you have advantage of the Hero Engine and the Phantom Knights that do just really powerful things. You can end on boards with like Gumblar and Darklaw, or you can extra link, or you've got the Phantom Knights to help you facilitate other different combo plays like getting Fogblade out of the deck for even more protection. It's a 60 card build, and it's actually really cool. I think one copy of Armageddon Knight or like a Dark Grepher or a Vision Hero Vion basically ends in like an extra link just with a single card, and that's crazy. Now, to be fair, I think Summon Sorceress is necessary for this deck to function, so this might be a US only build, but definitely something to keep in mind if you're in the US, that I think with a little more fine-tuning, this could be one of the better decks that might rise up as the format progresses. The last few decks I did want to cover though, we've got, there was a couple Mech Knights that weren't playing Invoked. I think there was like a Sky Striker Mech Knight and like a Brilliant Fusion Mech Knight, so I just wanted to mention that. That's kind of interesting. There was also a Gem Knight FTK. Now, I said in one of my previous videos last week that Gem Knight FTK is still a very viable threat. The combos are still there. The fact that Call by the Grave went to 2 is a little bit rough for its consistency, but honestly, the deck is still very viable, and it managed to take a top cut slot or 2, I can't remember exactly, but I know for sure it had at least 1, and that's just crazy. And again, this is one of those decks that can just come out of nowhere, and if you're not prepared for it, can completely take you by surprise and end your tournament career. So again, kudos to those players that were piloting the Gem Knight FTK. It actually had a very high success rate for the players that were playing it. I think on the European stream they said it actually had a very high win rate, even though it had a very low representation. So that's some very interesting information to keep in mind. And lastly, there was Spiral. Now, Spiral is again one of those decks that is able to just completely go off. It did take some consistency hits. I mean, it lost Terraforming, it lost a couple copies of Drones. So, you know, it's just slowly getting more neutered across each ban list. But again, it managed to make the top 64, and that's pretty damn good. Now, is it viable? I guess time will tell. It's got some pretty good advantages, like being able to go second and OTKing your opponent, but going first, I think its consistency problems might really catch up to it, which is why we didn't really see it go much further. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about the overall kind of roguish dark horse decks of the 200th YCS. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider becoming a YouTube channel member or backing me on Patreon, because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.